Sarah sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she clutched a stack of papers in her lap. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, glancing at the judge, the lawyers, and the quiet spectators in the back. She had waited for this moment for months, and now it was finally here. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. She was about to fight for something she believed was rightfully hers: child support for her youngest son, Elijah. Elijah was a bright, energetic toddler who had brought so much joy to Sarah's life. But raising him alone hadn't been easy. Her other children were older and more independent, but Elijah was still at an age where everything felt like a challenge. Between the sleepless nights and the constant juggling of work, errands, and parenting, Sarah was exhausted. She didn't have the resources she needed, and the stress was beginning to take its toll. It was in moments like these that she remembered the man she had been with years ago, Marcus. Marcus had been in her life briefly, but enough to have a lasting impact. She didn't have many good memories of their time together, but one thing was clear to Sarah: Marcus was the father of her son. Elijah resembled him in so many ways: his eyes, his smile, and even his stubbornness. Sarah was convinced that Marcus was the father, and she was certain that he should be responsible for Elijah's care. He hadn't been there when Elijah was born, but Sarah believed that now he needed to step up. She had made the decision to take him to court, knowing it was the only way to get the help she desperately needed. Sarah wasn't doing this out of anger or bitterness. She was doing it out of necessity. She knew that without financial assistance, her life would only get harder, and she didn't have the luxury of waiting any longer. The paperwork had been filed, the hearing was scheduled, and now she was here, standing before the judge, waiting for the proceedings to begin. As the judge called her case, Sarah felt her heart race. She stood up, walking to the front of the room, and took her seat at the table. She tried to steady her nerves, but the room felt so much bigger than she had imagined. She was ready to speak, to tell her side of the story, and to plead for what she felt was right. She glanced at the other side of the room, where Marcus was sitting. His face was calm, almost emotionless, as he prepared for what was to come. It was hard to read him. He wasn't showing any sign of anxiety or concern. Sarah opened her mouth, but her voice faltered at first. She had practiced her words countless times in her head, but now, in front of everyone, it felt different. She cleared her throat and began speaking, telling the judge about her struggles and why she believed Marcus should be held accountable. She spoke about the sleepless nights, the bills piling up, and the way Elijah depended on her. She described her emotional exhaustion, her frustration, and how the only solution she saw was the man sitting across from her. But even as she spoke, Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging doubt in her mind. Was she sure Marcus was really Elijah's father? Deep down, she questioned whether she had made the right decision. Would this all turn out the way she thought it would? As the words left her mouth, she wasn't entirely convinced herself, but she had come this far. There was no turning back now. The judge listened carefully, his expression serious and thoughtful. He didn't interrupt, but nodded as Sarah finished her statement. The room fell into a heavy silence, everyone waiting for the next step. Sarah sat back down, her heart racing. What would happen next? She could only wait to find out. Marcus sat quietly across from Sarah, his posture straight and his hands resting calmly on the table. He didn't look at her directly, but his eyes occasionally glanced toward her. His expression was calm, almost neutral, as if he had prepared himself for this moment. In fact, Marcus had been expecting this for a while. He had always known that the day would come when Sarah would ask him to take responsibility for Elijah. But deep down, Marcus wasn't sure he was the father. He had only known Sarah briefly, and their relationship had never been serious. It was a short fling from years ago, one that had never lasted beyond a few months. Sarah and Marcus had gone their separate ways long before Elijah was born. Marcus never saw any signs that they had a child together. It was confusing to him why she would suddenly claim him as Elijah's father. When he received the court papers, he had been surprised. He had been hoping that this would never happen. He wasn't the type to avoid responsibility, but he also didn't want to take on something that didn't belong to him. As far as Marcus was concerned, he had moved on with his life. He had his own children, a stable job, and he was involved in his community. He wasn't perfect, but he was doing the best he could. And now, here he was, sitting in this courtroom, facing a woman who was asking him for money to support a child he wasn't sure was his. When the judge called on him to speak, Marcus stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and made his way to the front. His mind raced, but his outward appearance remained calm. He wasn't angry or defensive. He just wanted the truth to come out. He couldn't help but wonder if there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding along the way. He addressed the judge in a steady voice, explaining that he did not believe he was Elijah's father. He told the court that he had known Sarah in the past, but their relationship had ended long before she ever had Elijah. He didn't remember any moments with Sarah where he could have fathered a child. He knew that in situations like these, DNA testing was usually the best way to confirm paternity, so he offered to take the test right away. "I'm not trying to avoid responsibility," Marcus said, looking at the judge. "But I don't think this is my child. If I'm wrong, I'll take whatever steps are necessary. But right now, I don't know how this could be." He sat back down, his mind swirling with thoughts of what would happen next. He glanced at Sarah, whose face was still tense. He could tell that she was upset, maybe even disappointed by his words, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to say anything more. He felt bad for her. He could see how much she was struggling, but he couldn't take responsibility for something that wasn't his. The judge nodded, understanding the situation, and ordered the DNA test to be done. Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and uncertainty. At least the truth would come out, but in the back of his mind, he was also wondering how this could affect everyone involved. Would this case be resolved quickly? Would there be more surprises in store? Marcus sat back in his seat, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but he was ready for whatever came next. The truth was all he wanted now, and he hoped it would set everyone free from the confusion and tension that had built up over the past months. The days between the court hearing and the DNA test results felt like an eternity for both Sarah and Marcus. Each day seemed to drag on longer than the last, and both of them couldn't help but wonder what the outcome would be. Sarah spent her time at home, going through the motions of daily life with Elijah, but her mind was never fully at ease. She would glance at her son and remember how similar he looked to Marcus. She had no doubt that he was the father, and she couldn't understand why he didn't see it. At the same time, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. Deep down, she knew that her memories of her time with Marcus were clouded. She had been with other men during that period, and the timeline was unclear. But there was something about the way Elijah acted, his mannerisms, the way he smiled. It all reminded her of Marcus. She hoped that once the results came back, everything would fall into place. The financial support she needed was so close, and she was holding on to the hope that Marcus would step up and be the father she knew he could be. Marcus, on the other hand, found himself unable to focus on anything else. His usual routine was disrupted by the uncertainty hanging over him. He had a good job, a steady life, and a loving relationship with his children, but this situation with Sarah and Elijah kept weighing on him. Every time he picked up his phone or checked his email, he wondered if today would be the day the results arrived. He kept thinking about the way Sarah had looked at him in court, almost pleading with him to take responsibility. It wasn't that Marcus didn't care about the child. He did, in a way, but he wasn't sure if he was the one who should be involved in Elijah's life. Marcus also thought a lot about the child's support. He had always been responsible with his own kids, making sure they had everything they needed. He wasn't rich, but he made sure they were well taken care of. The idea of being financially responsible for a child he wasn't sure made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to feel forced into something that wasn't right, and the idea of being dragged into a situation where he wasn't the father seemed unfair. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth needed to come out, whatever it may be. As the days passed, Marcus kept his distance from the situation. He didn't contact Sarah, and she didn't reach out to him either. Both were caught up in their own thoughts, hoping for clarity but afraid of the unknown. For Sarah, it was all about securing a better future for Elijah. She didn't have the luxury of waiting indefinitely. She needed stability, and she needed it soon. For Marcus, it was about protecting his family and his own peace of mind. He wanted to know the truth before he made any decisions. Finally, the day arrived. The letter from the lab was in the mail, and Sarah was the first to see it. She opened it with trembling hands, her heart racing as she read the results. Her eyes scanned the paper quickly, and she felt a chill run through her body as the truth began to settle in. The results were clear. Marcus was not Elijah's father. It was a shocking blow, not only to Sarah, but to Marcus as well, who had been waiting for confirmation of what he had known all along. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. She had been so sure. She had put so much faith into the idea that Marcus was the father, and now, all of that was gone. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How could she have been so wrong? What would she tell Elijah when he was older? The confusion and disbelief were overwhelming. For Marcus, there was a sense of relief mixed with confusion. He had known that the odds were against him, but seeing the official confirmation in black and white brought an odd sense of closure. He wasn't angry with Sarah. He understood her desperation. But the reality of the situation left him with more questions than answers. What was next for him? What was next for Elijah? And what was his role in all of this, if any? Both Sarah and Marcus were left to process the results, each dealing with the emotional fallout in their own way. The truth had been revealed, but the path forward was still unclear. All they knew for sure was that things were about to change, and neither of them was prepared for what would come next. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge opened the envelope containing the DNA test results. The tension was palpable, and everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Sarah sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had been so certain, so sure that Marcus was Elijah's father. But now, as the judge slowly unfolded the paper, she couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. The moment of truth had arrived. The judge looked up at the room, his face calm but serious. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with a measured tone. The results are in. The paternity test confirms that Marcus is not the father of Elijah. Sarah's heart sank. The words felt like a punch to her gut, and for a moment, she couldn't process what she had just heard. She stared at the judge, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Everything she had believed, everything she had fought for, had just been shattered in an instant. It was as if the floor had fallen out from under her. The courtroom around her seemed to fade, and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Marcus sat back in his chair, his face betraying little emotion, but inside, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had suspected this all along, but hearing the confirmation made it feel real. He wasn't the father. It was hard to say he felt completely happy about the news, but it was what he had been waiting for. The uncertainty had been draining him, and now finally there was clarity. However, he couldn't help but feel bad for Sarah. He could see the shock and disappointment in her face, and he knew this wasn't easy for her. Sarah struggled to keep her composure. The weight of the revelation was overwhelming. How could she have been so wrong? She had been so sure that Marcus was the father. She had seen the way Elijah looked at him, the way he resembled him in so many ways. For a brief moment, Sarah felt like she might break down right there in the courtroom. But she forced herself to stay calm, not wanting to lose control in front of everyone. The judge gave her a moment to collect herself before continuing. It is important that we address the next steps. Sarah, I understand this is a difficult situation, but we must now consider the legal implications of your claim. This court will need to determine the next course of action, regarding Elijah's paternity and support. Sarah nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. Her mind was spinning. She didn't know what to say or what to do next. Everything she had planned for the future of her son seemed to be slipping away. She had been so focused on getting Marcus to take responsibility for Elijah, and now, with the truth out in the open, she wasn't sure where to turn. What would she do now? How could she support her son if she couldn't get the help she needed? Marcus, meanwhile, felt a heavy weight lift off his shoulders. He hadn't been eager to get involved in a situation that wasn't his, but he knew now that he had to be careful with how he handled things going forward. This wasn't just about him anymore. There was a child involved, and that child needed support, whether from the real father or from someone else. Marcus wasn't sure what his role was, but he knew that stepping away completely wasn't an option. "I think we need to focus on what's best for Elijah now," Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to make sure he's okay." He glanced over at Sarah, who was still processing the news, and gave a small nod. Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaky but determined. I just don't understand how this happened. I thought Marcus was Elijah's father. I had no idea it wasn't him." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I need to find the real father. I need to know who he is." The judge, who had been quietly observing, nodded. "That is the next logical step. If there is another man who could be Elijah's father, you will need to establish paternity with him. This court will help facilitate that process." He paused for a moment, looking at Sarah. "I know this is difficult, but you must remember that the truth will help you move forward. For both you and Elijah." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had so many emotions swirling in her head, and it was hard to focus on anything clearly. The one thing she did know was that her path had just become much more complicated. She had hoped that today would bring her the answers she needed, but instead, it had left her with more questions than ever. The judge adjourned the session, and everyone slowly filed out of the courtroom. Sarah and Marcus were left in the quiet room, each lost in their own thoughts. Neither of them was prepared for what would come next, but both of them knew one thing. Their lives were about to change in ways they hadn't expected. The following days after the court hearing were filled with confusion and doubt. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping through her fingers. The idea of finding the real father of Elijah seemed impossible, and yet she knew it was the only choice she had left. The weight of the situation bore down on her as she tried to figure out how to move forward. She had been so sure that Marcus was Elijah's father, and now that belief had crumbled. It felt like the ground beneath her was shaking, and she didn't know how to regain her footing. In the days that followed, Sarah spent a lot of time thinking about her past. She remembered the relationship she had been in during the time she conceived Elijah. It was a confusing time in her life. There had been a few men, and she was unsure of the exact dates when she had been with each one. But there was one man who stood out in her mind: David. He was the man who had been around the same time Elijah was conceived, but they had lost touch shortly after that. Sarah hadn't been in contact with him for quite some time, and she didn't even know where he was now. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that David might very well be Elijah's father. With the DNA test confirming Marcus was not the father, Sarah knew she had to find David. She wasn't sure how to begin, but she couldn't waste any more time. She knew Elijah deserved answers. After all, every child deserved to know who their father was. For Elijah's sake, Sarah decided to track down David. She started by reaching out to some old friends who had known David back in the day. She asked around, hoping someone had kept in touch with him. After a few days, one of her friends gave her the contact information she needed. It was a bit of a relief to finally have a lead, but Sarah couldn't help but feel nervous. What would she say to David? How would he react to the news that he was Elijah's father? The first time Sarah called David, her hand shook as she dialed the number. It had been years since they last spoke, and she wasn't sure what kind of person he had become. Would he be angry? Would he want nothing to do with Elijah? There were so many questions running through her mind, and she was afraid of the answers she might get. David answered on the second ring. His voice was familiar, but a little rough, as though he had been through his own struggles. When Sarah told him who she was, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear him take a deep breath before he spoke. "I didn't expect to hear from you, Sarah," he said quietly. "What's going on?" Taking a moment to gather her thoughts, Sarah explained everything that had happened. The court hearing, the DNA test, and how she now believed David might be Elijah's father. There was a silence on the other end, and Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She waited for him to respond, not sure if he would be angry, confused, or even dismissive. But after a long pause, David spoke again. "I didn't know, Sarah," he said softly. "I didn't know about Elijah. But I guess it makes sense, now that I think about it. If he's my son, then I need to take responsibility. He's my child, and I need to step up." Sarah was taken aback by his response. She had expected a lot of things: denial, anger, or even avoidance. But David's calm acceptance caught her by surprise. It wasn't the reaction she had anticipated, but in that moment, Sarah felt a wave of relief. Elijah's father was willing to acknowledge him, and that was all she needed for now. The conversation ended with Sarah and David agreeing to meet in person. It was a huge step, but Sarah knew it was the only way to move forward. She needed David to meet Elijah, and she needed to see if he was truly ready to be involved in their son's life. Over the next few days, Sarah prepared herself for the meeting. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was hopeful. She hoped that David would live up to his words and take his place in Elijah's life. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like there might be a light at the end of the tunnel. She wasn't sure what the future held, but at least now, she knew she was one step closer to finding the answers Elijah needed. As the meeting approached, Sarah couldn't help but feel nervous. It had been so long since she had seen David, and she wasn't sure how he had changed over the years. Would he still be the man she remembered, or would he be someone entirely different? All she could do was wait, hoping that David would follow through on his commitment and become the father Elijah deserved. The day of the meeting finally arrived, and Sarah could hardly keep her nerves in check. She had spent the entire morning preparing herself and Elijah. She didn't want to get her hopes up too much, but a part of her couldn't help but feel a glimmer of excitement. This could be the moment when everything changed. Elijah had the right to know who his father was, and this meeting would determine whether David would be a part of his life. As Sarah stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street, she felt a mix of emotions. She had come a long way since the court hearing, and she was beginning to accept that the truth would bring some difficult changes. But she was determined to make sure that Elijah had the father figure he deserved. Even if things didn't work out with David, she knew she had done everything she could. At the same time, Sarah was also wondering what Elijah would think about all this. He was still so young, but he had started asking questions about his father. Sarah hadn't wanted to tell him too much, knowing that the situation was still uncertain. But she knew it wouldn't be long before Elijah realized that his story wasn't like the other kids at school who had both their parents around. This meeting could change everything for him too. When the doorbell rang, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath and opened the door to find David standing there, looking a little unsure of himself. He wasn't the same man Sarah remembered, but there was something familiar about him too. Time had changed him, and he looked older, maybe a little more worn, but his eyes were the same. And for a moment, Sarah wondered if this was the right decision. "Hey," David said, giving her a small, nervous smile. "I'm here." Sarah nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in," she said, trying to sound as calm as possible. She could feel her pulse racing, but she didn't want to let him see how nervous she was. Elijah was in the other room, playing with his toys, unaware of what was about to happen. David took a seat on the couch, looking around the small living room as he adjusted to the unfamiliar surroundings. He looked at Sarah, his expression still unsure. "I don't really know what to expect here," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd be in this situation." Sarah gave him a small, understanding smile. "Neither did I, honestly. But here we are." She led David into the room where Elijah was, who was sitting on the floor playing with a toy car. When he saw David, Elijah looked up, curious but cautious. Sarah's heart fluttered a little as she watched the two of them. This was the moment of truth. Would David step up? Would he want to get to know his son? "Elijah, this is David," Sarah said softly. He's your father." Elijah looked up at David, his innocent eyes wide with curiosity. David gave a nervous smile, sitting down on the floor in front of him. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm your dad." For a moment, there was silence. Elijah didn't say anything. He just studied David closely, trying to make sense of the situation. Sarah could see that he was trying to process everything. It wasn't often that children his age were suddenly faced with this kind of truth. David reached out a hand, and Elijah looked at it, unsure. David smiled reassuringly, his voice calm. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. I just wanted to meet you." Slowly, Elijah reached out and placed his small hand in David's. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had hoped for this moment for so long, and seeing it happen in front of her made everything feel a little more real. David was here. He had shown up, and he was taking the first step. David looked up at Sarah, his expression a mix of emotion. "I didn't know Sarah," he said quietly, "but now that I do, I want to be here for him." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she nodded. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like things might be okay. Elijah was meeting his father, and that was a huge step. There was still a long way to go, but this was a start. David spent the next hour talking to Elijah, asking him about his favorite toys, his favorite games, and just getting to know him. The atmosphere in the room started to feel less tense, and Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in days. Maybe David wasn't perfect, and maybe this wasn't going to be easy, but for right now, Sarah was content. Elijah had a father who cared, and that was enough. As the meeting came to a close, David stood up and gave Elijah a hug. "I'll be back to see you soon, okay?" he said gently. Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders as she watched the two of them interact. This was the beginning of something new, and while it wasn't going to be easy, it was a step in the right direction. The days following David's visit were filled with a sense of change for Sarah and Elijah. It felt like things were starting to move in the right direction, but the uncertainty still lingered. Sarah wasn't sure what David's next move would be, or how involved he was going to be in Elijah's life. She wanted to believe that he was serious about being a father, but part of her was still cautious. She had been through so much already, and she wasn't sure if she could handle another disappointment. In the weeks that followed, David did keep his word. He called regularly to check in on Elijah, asking how he was doing and if he needed anything. There was a noticeable shift in his tone, a level of commitment that hadn't been there before. David also started to make plans to see Elijah more often. The visits were small at first, just an afternoon here and there, playing with toys or going to the park. But Sarah noticed the effort he was putting in. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Elijah, it meant the world. Sarah watched as David grew more comfortable around Elijah. The two of them started to bond over small things, playing video games, reading books, and even cooking together. It wasn't perfect, and sometimes it felt awkward, but Sarah could see that Elijah was beginning to accept David into his life. Elijah had always been a bit shy, but now he was opening up in ways Sarah hadn't expected. The little boy who had once only asked about his father out of curiosity was now eagerly waiting for David's next visit. But even with the progress, Sarah couldn't shake her worries. She knew that David was trying, but she also knew how hard it could be to build a relationship from the ground up. Elijah was so young, and even though he was starting to warm up to David, It would take time for their bond to truly form. Sarah also felt a growing responsibility. She had to balance her own feelings and fears with what was best for Elijah. She didn't want him to get hurt if things didn't work out, but she also didn't want to hold him back from the opportunity to have a father figure in his life. One afternoon, when David was over for one of his regular visits, Sarah decided to have a heart-to-heart with him. She needed to understand his intentions, to make sure that he was truly committed to Elijah. As she watched Elijah play with his toys in the other room, Sarah turned to David. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice quiet. "I know you're trying, and I appreciate it. But I need to know, really know, are you in this for the long run? Elijah needs consistency. He needs to know that you're going to be there for him." David looked at her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I know I've made mistakes in the past, Sarah. I know I can't change that. But I want to be here for him. I want to do right by Elijah. He deserves that. And I'm not going anywhere." Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her as she listened to his words. It wasn't the perfect answer, but it was a good start. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, she believed that David might actually be ready to take responsibility. "I just don't want to see him hurt," Sarah said softly. "He's been through enough already. I can't put him through any more confusion or pain." David nodded, his tone more serious now. "I understand. I'm not going to make promises I can't keep, but I do want to be there for him. I'll do my best. That's all I can offer right now." It wasn't the certainty Sarah had hoped for, but it was enough to give her a sense of hope. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't facing them alone. Over the next few months, David kept his word. He started coming over more frequently, helping Elijah with school projects, taking him out for ice cream, and simply spending time together. Sarah watched the bond between them grow slowly but steadily. David wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and Elijah seemed to be thriving in the presence of his father. It was clear that the connection was beginning to deepen, and Sarah was grateful for the progress they were making. However, Sarah still felt a lingering anxiety about the future. She wasn't sure what would happen if things ever went wrong again, but she reminded herself that it was okay to take things one day at a time. Elijah was happy. He had a father who cared about him, even if it was still a work in progress. And for now, that was enough. As time passed, Sarah and David had more conversations about their roles in Elijah's life, and they worked together to make sure they were both involved in raising him. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of uncertainty, but there was one thing that was clear. Sarah had given Elijah the chance to have a relationship with his father, and David was stepping up to the challenge. Slowly, but surely, Sarah began to let go of the fears that As the months passed, Sarah began to feel a growing sense of peace. The uncertainty that had clouded her mind for so long was slowly fading away. David had kept his promise. He was there for Elijah, and with every visit, their bond seemed to strengthen. While the road hadn't been easy, Sarah could see the positive changes in both of them. Elijah was happier, more confident, and more comfortable in his relationship with David. It was a relief for Sarah to know that she hadn't made a mistake by giving David a chance. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Sarah sat on the porch, watching David and Elijah play in the yard. Elijah had just come back from a Little League game, and David was cheering him on as he ran around the yard. It was a sight Sarah never thought she'd see. The two of them were laughing and having fun together, a picture of a father and son enjoying their time. Sarah couldn't help but feel proud of how far they had come. She thought back to the day she had first learned about the DNA results, the confusion, the pain, and the uncertainty. At the time, it seemed impossible to see how things would ever get better. But now, looking at Elijah and David, she realized how much had changed. She had taken a leap of faith, and although it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. Elijah had a father who loved him, and she had witnessed that transformation with her own eyes. As David approached her, he smiled, wiping his brow after a long game of catch with Elijah. "He's getting better every day," David said, his voice filled with pride. Sarah smiled back, feeling a warmth in her heart. "He really is. You two are doing great together." David sat next to her, his expression thoughtful. "I never thought I'd be in this position, Sarah. I was scared at first, not knowing if I could be the kind of father Elijah needed. But I'm glad I didn't run away from it. I'm glad I stayed. He's a great kid." Sarah nodded, grateful for his honesty. "I know it's not always been easy, but I can see how much you care about him. That's all that matters." David reached over and placed his hand on hers. "I want you to know that I'm here for both of you. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." Sarah's eyes filled with emotion. She had hoped for this moment for so long, but she had never expected it to feel so real. She had worried so much about what could go wrong, but now she realized that the only thing that mattered was that David was there. Elijah had a father who was willing to step up, and that was enough to give her hope for their future. Later that evening, as Sarah tucked Elijah into bed, he smiled up at her. "Mom, I'm really glad I got to meet Dad," he said softly. "It's fun when he comes over." Sarah's heart swelled with happiness. "I'm glad too, sweetheart. I'm really happy you two are getting along." Elijah's smile widened. "I think he's pretty cool." Sarah kissed him on the forehead, her heart full of gratitude. "I'm glad you think so." As she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, Sarah stood in the hallway for a moment, reflecting on the journey they had all been on. She had learned so much about trust, forgiveness, and the importance of giving people a chance. She had feared the unknown, worried that things would never work out. But in the end, her leap of faith had paid off. David had proven himself, and Elijah was thriving. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt optimistic. She had been through a lot to get to this point, but now there was peace in her heart. She could rest easy knowing that Elijah had both of his parents in his life, and that David was there to support him. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but Sarah knew that together they could face anything. As Sarah sat down to unwind for the evening, she realized that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The road ahead might not always be smooth, but she now believed that as long as they stuck together, they could weather any storm. Elijah was surrounded by love, and that was all that mattered. With a sense of calm settling over her, Sarah looked out the window and smiled. Everything was going to be okay.